We're going to break it down into 3 separate parts. The first part we're going to go over is the anatomy of the CNS. From there, we're going to break it down into 3 other parts, starting with the meninges, going to the lobes of the brain, and then finally the sensory areas. After that, we shall go over the anatomy of the PNS, breaking it down into 2 separate parts, the cranial nerves and the spinal nerves. Finally, we'll do the reflexes, breaking it down to the reflex arc. Today we're going to go over the anatomy of the CNS, which contains the meninges and the lobes of the brain. In the meninges, there's the dura mater, which is the outer layer that contains the nerve cell bodies. And then we have the arachnoid matter, which is the middle layer that contains cerebral spinal fluid in the subarachnoid space. And then we have the pia mater, which is the inner layer that contains nerves and blood vessels. In the lobes of the brain, we have the frontal lobe, which concentration, planning, complex problem solving, and emotional behavior. We have the parietal, which is understanding speech, choosing words to express thoughts and feelings. We have the temporal, which is the auditory, which interprets complex sensory experiences and stores memory. We have the occipital, which analyzes and combines visual images with sensory experiences. And then we have the insula, which translates sensory information into proper emotional responses. In some of these lobes, there are areas that relate to specific senses. In the parietal lobe, there's the cutaneous sensory area, which is used for sensation on the skin. In the temporal lobe, there is the auditory sensory area as well, the sensory area for smell. Between these 2 lobes, you also have the sensory area for speech, which is also known as the Wernicke's area. In the occipital lobe, you have the visual sensory area, and lastly, in the insula, you have sensory areas for taste, which is also used in gustation. Part of the anatomy of the CNS is the Diencephalon and the Brainstem. The Diencephalon is made of gray matter, and it's broken into the thalamus, hypothalamus, and the limbic system. The limbic system is broken into the optic tracts, the optic chiasma, the infundibulum, posterior pituitary, mammillary bodies, and the pineal gland. It's also known as the emotional brain. Now, the thalamus serves as the gateway for sensory impulses, receives all sensory impulses, and then channels said impulses into the appropriate part of the cerebral cortex. The hypothalamus maintains homeostasis and links the nervous and endocrine systems. And the limbic system controls the emotional response, feelings, behavior oriented towards survival, and reacts to potential life-threatening upsets. And we go down to the brainstem, which we start with the midbrain, which is the short section of the brainstem. It contains bundles of fibers that join lower parts of the brainstem and spinal cord with higher parts of the brainstem. It has the cerebral aqueduct, the cerebral pinnacles, the corpora quadrumana, and then we have the pons, which is underneath the midbrain. The pons are rounded bulge on the underside of the brainstem. It relays nerve impulses between the Medulla Oblongata and the cerebrum, and helps regulate the rhythm of breathing. After that, we have the Medulla Oblongata, which is the enlarged continuation of the spinal cord. It contains cardiac, vasomotor, and respiratory control centers, and it is often fatal when injured.
We're going to cover the anatomy of the peripheral nervous system, which is broken down into the cranial nerves and the spinal nerves. The cranial nerves are the nerves that come from the brain out through the skull to like the facial area, and the spinal nerves come out of the spinal column through the vertebrae. You have 12 pairs of cranial nerves, and they're listed in Roman numerals. The first one, cranial nerve 1, is the olfactory nerve, which is used in smell. You have cranial nerve 2, the optic nerve, which is used in sight. Cranial nerve 3 is the ocular motor nerve, which helps move the eye. You got the oculo, eye, and motor movement, right? Cranial nerve 4 is the trochlear nerve, which is the smallest motor nerve and also helps move the eye. You have cranial nerve 5, the trigeminal or the mental nerve, is right here on your mandible, and it helps with like sensations in your teeth, as well as helping move the lower part of your jaw. You have cranial nerve 6, the abducens nerve, which is the it's a motor nerve that helps move the eye, but it's mostly side to side. You have cranial nerve 7, which is the facial nerve. It's a mixed type of nerve that helps with some taste and facial expressions, so smiling, frowning, all that stuff that comes from the facial nerve. 8, you have the vestibulocochlear nerve, which helps in hearing. It attached to the vestibule and the cochlea in the ear. Cranial nerve 9 is the glossopharyngeal nerve, which is another mix that helps a little bit with taste, and it has tongue movement. Cranial nerve 10 is the vagus nerve, and that is another mixed nerve, and it helps with all of your internal organs and like your heartbeat. It's a very important nerve. Cranial nerve 11 is the accessory nerve, which is, it's a motor nerve, but it's kind of like an in-between nerve. Cranial nerve 12 is the hypoglossal, which is another motor nerve, and it helps with speech. So if you see these little markings, cranial nerves 1, 2, and 8 marked in blue, these are sensory only. So you've got smell, sight, and hearing, right? These are ones that just send input to the brain. They don't receive input to like move or anything. These ones marked in black, 3, 4, 6, 11, and 12 are motor only nerves. So they don't send any input to the brain, they receive it and move things. So mostly like moving the eye or moving the tongue. All right. After these 12 pairs of cranial nerves, we have the spinal nerves, where there's 31 pairs. Now these match up for the most part with your vertebrae. Instead of 7 in your cervical area, you have 8, but you still have 12 in your thoracic area back here. You've got 5 in your lumbar, 5 in your sacral, and 1 in the coccygeal area. And those are all, they send input, or they send information to your muscles in your appendicular skeleton, to move. So you can like move your arm, move your leg. Those are coming from spinal nerves. And that covers the anatomy of the peripheral nervous system.
Reflexes, specifically the reflex arc, which starts with the receptor, which is the end of a dendrite or specialized receptor cell in a sensory organ. Then, next is the sensory neuron, the dendrite, cell body, and axon of a sensory neuron. Next is the interneuron, which is the dendrite, cell body, and axon of a neuron within the brain or spinal cord. Then we have the motor neuron, which is the dendrite, cell body, and axon of a motor neuron. And up next is the effector, which is a muscle or gland. Take it away, Matt.
We're going to use the biceps jerk reflex. So we're going to pretend this board is really hot. So if I touch the hot board, the first thing I want to do is pull my hand away, right? So one is called the biceps jerk reflex because pulling my hand away or flexing my forearm is contracting the bicep. All right. But to go through these steps, the first part is the receptor. So when I touch the board, I receive information about the board, like this board is hot. This information gets sent through the sensory neuron to the interneuron in your spinal cord. Right? That interneuron then talks to the motor neurons in your bicep, telling the muscle to contract. This is the effector. This pulls your hand away from the heat source. And that's the biceps jerk reflex. There's plenty of other ones, such as the tricep jerk reflex, which extends the forearm. Knee jerk, all of those are examples of reflexes.
Okay, now it's for Chapter 11 recap. We went over the anatomy of the CNS, which includes the brain and the spinal cord. In the brain, we have the Diencephalon, the midbrain, and the lobes of cerebrum. All right, next we went over the anatomy of the PNS, which is the cranial nerves and the spinal nerves. In your cranial nerves, you have 1 through 12. In your spinal nerves, you have 31 pairs. And finally, we went over the reflexes, which is the reflex arc. For example, we have the bicep jerk reflex. And these are the things that we went over in Chapter 11's recap.